No orders, no support, no extraction plan. June 1972. The Jebel Akhdar in the Sultanate of Oman. 4 men from B Squadron, 22 Special Air Service Regiment. They were supposed to be trainers. The designation was British Army Training Team, abbreviated BATT. They were assigned to a Hereford, an irregular force of tribal fighters who had switched allegiance from the Marxist PF-LOAG insurgents to the Sultan's government. 4 SAS men, a sergeant, a corporal, and 2 lance corporals. They were equipped with rifles, a radio, field rations, and maps of the region that were not completely accurate. They had been told their mission was to advise and train. That was the official story. That was what would be written in the reports that were filed with the Ministry of Defence in London. That was the lie they were all going to tell if anyone ever asked the British government what the SAS was doing in Oman. On the night of June 18th, their Hereford collapsed under a concentrated assault by PF-LOAG fighters. The Sultan's forces retreated. The orders that had authorized the BATT team's advisory role were suddenly void, but the 4 SAS men stayed. They had no orders to do what came next. They had no support from the Dhofar Brigade. They had no extraction plan anymore, and they were already deep behind insurgent lines. So they did what SAS soldiers do. They continued the operation as if the orders hadn't been cancelled, and nobody, for decades, would ever officially admit they'd been there at all. Oman was a place where the British government operated in shadow. The Sultanate of Oman, governed by Sultan Qaboos bin Said Al Said, was strategically important in ways that went far beyond the immediate region. It sat on the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point that controlled one of the world's most critical oil shipping routes. To the north of Oman was Iran, increasingly unstable as the decade progressed toward revolution. To the west was Saudi Arabia, the fundamental American ally in the Middle East. And along the coast and deep in the mountains of Dhofar was the Dhofar Rebellion, PF-LOAG, the Popular Front for the Liberation of the Occupied Arabian Gulf, which was backed by South Yemen and supported materially and ideologically by the Soviet Union. To the Western powers during the Cold War, Oman was a crucial piece of territory that could not be allowed to fall to a communist-aligned insurgency. If the Sultan's government fell, if PF-LOAG took control, if the Sultanate became part of the Soviet sphere of influence, then the geopolitical calculations for the entire Middle East would shift. The Soviet Union would have a foothold on the Arabian Peninsula. They would have an entry point into the Persian Gulf. They would have access to the Strait of Hormuz. The implications were catastrophic from a Western perspective. But there was a profound problem with this geopolitical imperative. Officially, the British government was committed to non-interference in the internal affairs of other nations. That was the public position. That was the position stated in Parliament. That was the position defended at the United Nations. And so, when the decision was made, somewhere in the halls of the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Defence, the decision had to be made carefully and with deniability built into every single element of the operation. To send British Special Forces to Oman to help the Sultan suppress the PF-LOAG insurgency, it had to be done in a way that could be plausibly denied. The government could not tell Parliament that it was sending the SAS to Oman to fight communists. That would create questions. That would create parliamentary debates. That would expose the lie that Britain was not interfering in the affairs of other nations. Enter the British Army Training Team. The BATT designation was the cover. The official story, which would be told in Parliament if anyone asked, was that the British Army, in response to a request from the Sultan of Oman for military assistance, had sent a small number of advisors and trainers to help build the Omani armed forces. These advisors, BAT teams, would live with Omani units, provide training in tactics and organization, offer advice on personnel management and logistics, and then eventually withdraw once the Omani forces were sufficiently trained. They would not participate in combat. They would not conduct combat operations. They would not, in any substantive sense, be engaged in the actual fighting. This was the story that would be told in Parliament if anyone pressed the issue. This was the position that would be maintained in international forums. And it was, technically speaking, a comprehensive lie. The BATT teams were staffed entirely by SAS personnel, Every member of a BATT team was selected from the regiment. They were trained not just in advisory techniques but in direct action, ambush, counter-ambush, and raid operations. They participated in combat operations regularly. They conducted raids against insurgent positions. They conducted ambushes against insurgent patrols. They conducted reconnaissance missions deep in insurgent-held territory. They were, in every practical sense, combat advisors. They did not just advise from the rear, they participated directly in the fighting. But the official position held. It held because the government of the time made the calculation that the geopolitical necessity of maintaining the Sultan in power outweighed the need for transparency. And everyone involved in the operation understood that this lie was a necessary part of the operation. The structure of deniability was not an accident or an improvisation. It was carefully constructed to allow military operations to be conducted while maintaining political cover for the government. If Parliament asked questions, the government could say that the SAS was not conducting combat operations. It was providing training and advice. If any British personnel were killed or captured, the government could claim that the personnel should not have been there, that they were acting beyond their mandate, that the government was not responsible for operations that exceeded the official advisory role. The deniability framework created a space in which the SAS could conduct the operations that were necessary for national security, while the government could maintain the legal fiction that no such operations were actually being conducted. The 4 men of the BATT team attached to the Hereford that was supposed to be training with tribal forces in the Geopolitical had been in Oman for several months by June 1972. They had come in during the initial phases of the BATT deployment. They had gone through the complicated process of establishing themselves with the Hereford commander, of building rapport with the tribal fighters who were nominally under his command, of beginning the training process that was supposed to gradually improve the Hereford's combat capability and readiness. They had conducted patrols in the mountains. They had learned the terrain in ways that no amount of map study could have taught them. They had begun to understand the enemy's tactics, the patterns of PF-LOAG operations, the way that the insurgents moved in the mountains, the way they avoided large-scale engagements and preferred to attack isolated positions or small patrols. They had begun to understand the political dimensions of the conflict, which Hereford leaders had genuine loyalty to the Sultan, which ones were hedging their bets by maintaining contacts with PF-LOAG, which ones were primarily motivated by personal advancement rather than political conviction. The relationship between the SAS advisors and the Hereford fighters had gradually developed from a formal advisory relationship into something more collaborative. The SAS men had demonstrated their competence through their conduct on patrols. They had proven that they could navigate the mountains. They had proven that they could fight effectively. They had proven that they were willing to share the risks that the Hereford fighters faced. As a result, the Hereford leaders had begun to listen to the SAS advice not just because the SAS were British military advisors, but because the SAS had earned credibility through their actions. But as they were learning these things, they were also beginning to understand something else. The situation was more fragile than anyone had told them. The PF-LOAG was stronger than the official intelligence assessments suggested. The Omani government forces were more poorly trained and equipped than the reports indicated. And the insurgency was not collapsing or being worn down by attrition. It was consolidating. It was becoming more organized. It was beginning to mount larger operations. The Hereford they were attached to was not growing more confident. It was becoming more nervous. And when insurgent forces began to concentrate in the mountains above their position, when the signs of a major PF-LOAG assault began to accumulate, that nervousness turned into fear. The 4 SAS men could see it. They could read the signs. They knew what was coming. And they knew that if a major assault occurred, the Hereford forces would not hold. The tribal fighters were brave, but they were not trained for coordinated defense against a determined assault. They did not have the discipline. They did not have the command structure. They did not have the experience of defending prepared positions under fire. The Hereford were light infantry, capable of raiding and patrolling, but not capable of sustained defense in fortified positions. The SAS advisors understood that a determined PF-LOAG attack would overwhelm the Hereford positions. The June 18th 1972. The attack came at night, in the darkness, with coordinated assaults on multiple Furkat positions spread across the region. The PF-LOAG fighters had been infiltrating into the mountains for days, positioning themselves for what they calculated would be a decisive engagement that would break the back of the pro-Sultan forces in this sector of the Jebel. They had chosen the moment carefully. They had superior numbers at the point of contact. They had the initiative. The Furkat positions were not heavily fortified. They relied on concealment more than on prepared defensive positions. The Furkat were positioned in locations that made tactical sense, but that would be difficult to defend against a coordinated attack. When the attack came, it came with intensity that overwhelmed the defenses. Automatic fire from multiple positions, hand grenades thrown at close range, waves of insurgents moving through the darkness with the confidence of soldiers who knew they had the advantage. The Furkat fighters, outnumbered and unprepared for the scale of the assault, began to break. Some fought back, attempting to return fire. Some ran, abandoning their positions and trying to escape to the south toward the main Sultan's positions. Some tried to position themselves defensively, but without coordinated command, without clear communication about where the enemy was coming from, the coherence of the defensive effort simply collapsed within minutes. What had been a functional Furkat force was fragmenting into small groups of men attempting to escape to the south. The command structure was breaking down. The authority of the Furkat commander was evaporating. Officers were being killed or were falling back with their own men rather than maintaining a coordinated defense. The 4 SAS men were in a position when the attack began. They had radios, they had weapons, they had training that told them exactly what to do in an ambush or an assault: take cover, return fire, organize the surrounding fighters, suppress the enemy fire, call for support, and prepare for extraction. They worked through those procedures methodically. But as they attempted to organize the Furkat fighters in a coherent response, as they tried to establish defensive positions and suppress PF-LOAG fire, they realized that something was happening that they hadn't entirely anticipated. The support that would normally come, airstrikes from RAF aircraft based at Salalah, helicopter evacuation, reinforcement from the Dhofar Brigade, wasn't arriving. The chain of command, somewhere above them, had gone quiet. Their radio calls for air support were being acknowledged by someone at the other end of the radio link, but they were not being answered with actual aircraft. Their calls for reinforcement were being acknowledged, but no forces were being committed. Their calls for helicopter evacuation were being received, but no helicopters were being dispatched. And the Furkat, as an organized fighting force, was ceasing to exist in front of their eyes. Small groups of Furkat fighters were still fighting. Some Furkat elements had managed to escape to the south toward the Sultan's positions. But the coherent unit that the SAS team had been training and advising was broken and scattered beyond recovery. The orders that had originally sent them to Oman as trainers with a clear mission and clear support structures, those orders were now, in the confusion and the darkness and the incoming fire, effectively superseded by the reality on the ground. The sergeant leading the 4-man team made a calculation. He was pinned down with 3 other men. His unit was broken. No support was coming. The Furkat was dissolving around them. Staying in position meant being overrun or being captured by the PF-LOAG fighters who were consolidating their victory. Moving south meant attempting an extraction that wasn't planned and might not be possible. But staying put was worse than any risk that movement entailed. The sergeant ordered the team to break contact and move south toward the Dhofar Brigade positions. It was a decision that had no authorization from higher command. It was a decision that transformed the BTT team from trainers into independent combat operators. It was a decision that, if it came to light, would have forced the British government to explain exactly what was happening in Oman. And it was the right decision. The sergeant who made this decision was a professional soldier. He had years of experience. He had conducted operations in various theaters. He understood the situation on the ground. He understood that staying in a broken defensive position was a formula for death or capture. He understood that the only option available was to move, to evade, to survive, and to try to reach friendly forces. He understood that his mission had changed from advisory to survival. He understood that the responsibility he bore for the 3 men under his command, for the intelligence he had gathered, for the continuation of the operation in some form, was enormous. But he made the decision. He ordered the team to move, and the team moved. They broke contact with the enemy. They moved south. They began the process of surviving in the mountains. This kind of decision, the decision to transform yourself from an advisor into a combat operator, the decision to take action that has no authorization, the decision to trust your own judgment in the face of silence from higher command, is the kind of decision that defines the careers of special operations soldiers. Some soldiers would have waited for orders. Some soldiers would have tried to maintain their advisory role even as everything collapsed around them. Some soldiers would have assumed that the lack of support meant they should not be doing what they were doing. But this sergeant and these 3 men understood that sometimes you have to trust your own judgment. Sometimes you have to act in the absence of orders. Sometimes you have to do what makes sense operationally, even if it is not authorized politically. The Dhofar War was part of a larger Cold War competition for influence in the Middle East. The Soviet Union was trying to extend its reach into the Arabian Peninsula. The Western powers, Britain, the United States, and others, were trying to prevent that extension. The Sultan of Oman was aligned with the West. The PFLOAG was aligned with the Communists. The outcome of the conflict would determine whether Oman remained in the Western sphere or whether it would shift toward Soviet influence. That was the larger context. That was what made the SAS commitment in Oman strategically important. That was what made the 4-man BTT team's continued operations during the June 1972 crisis operationally significant. They were holding the line at a moment when the line was in danger of breaking. They were sustaining the Sultan's position at a moment when the Sultan's forces had been dealt a serious blow. They were gathering intelligence and conducting operations that, while not authorized, were nevertheless contributing to the broader objective of maintaining Oman's alignment with the West. The government knew this. The military command knew this. Everyone knew that the 4 men were doing something important, something necessary. But the government could not officially acknowledge it. Because if the government acknowledged it, the entire BTT framework would come into question. If the government acknowledged that BAT teams were conducting combat operations without authorization, then the question would arise: on what authority were they conducting those operations? And that question would be impossible to answer in ways that were politically acceptable. And so the government's solution was to not acknowledge it, to allow the operation to continue without authorization, to understand that it was happening and to choose to allow it to happen, and to never formally acknowledge it afterward. What happened over the next 11 days was never fully documented, at least not in any official record that was ever released to the public or to Parliament. The 4 men moved through mountains that were partially controlled by the PFLOAG. They had water, not enough, but enough to survive. They had ammunition for their rifles. They had maps of the region that were not entirely accurate. They had a radio that could, intermittently, reach British command elements if they transmitted on the right frequency and at the right time. They conducted themselves as a patrol. They moved at night, hid during the day, avoided enemy positions when possible, and engaged enemy patrols when contact couldn't be avoided. There is fragmentary evidence in various historical accounts and in regimental memory that they conducted reconnaissance of PFLOAG concentrations. There is evidence that they called in fire missions on enemy positions, requesting support from RAF aircraft or from artillery that was within range. There is evidence that they engaged in firefights with insurgent patrols who discovered them or who stumbled across their positions. The precise details of what occurred during those 11 days remain obscured by both the passage of time and by the deliberate classification of the operation. What is known is that the 4 men not only survived but continued to gather intelligence and to conduct operations that were consistent with their role as combat operators, rather than as simple trainers. They were not passive observers of the military situation. They were active participants in the campaign to defend the Sultan's position. But there is no official record of any of it because they were never supposed to be there conducting operations. They were supposed to be advisory. They were supposed to be training. They were not supposed to be conducting independent combat operations without orders from the British chain of command, and yet they were. And the question of why they were never ordered to cease, why they were never ordered to attempt extraction, why they were never ordered to do anything other than continue to operate, is a question that points directly to the structure of deniability that had been built into the entire Oman operation. If the British government acknowledged that 4 SAS men had been conducting independent combat operations in Oman without orders from the British chain of command, then the British government would have to acknowledge that combat operations were being conducted in Oman at all. If combat operations were being conducted, if the government acknowledged it, then the BATT cover story would collapse. If the BATT cover story collapsed, then the government would have to explain to Parliament exactly what the SAS was doing in Oman, on what authority, under what legal framework, and with what rules of engagement. And that was something the government was not going to do. It was politically impossible. It would create questions that had no comfortable answers. They gathered intelligence. They reported what they were seeing to the British command structure. They conducted patrols through the mountains. They engaged the enemy when engagement was necessary. They avoided contact when avoidance was possible. And gradually, over those 11 days, the situation on the ground changed. Reinforcements from the Dhofar Brigade, properly authorized, properly supported, began to move north from their positions in the south. PF LOAG positions were being struck from the air. RAF aircraft, having been committed by higher command, were flying missions against insurgent concentrations. The overall military situation, which had looked dire on June 18th, began to stabilize and then began to improve. By the end of June, the immediate crisis was past. The PF LOAG assault had failed to achieve its objective. The Sultan's forces were holding. The insurgency was not in collapse, but neither was it advancing. And the 4 SAS men, still operating without orders authorizing their independent action, still without a formal extraction plan, were able to make their way south toward the Dhofar Brigade positions and eventually out of the operational area. They exfiltrated intact, no casualties, no one lost, no compromise of their position or their extraction route. They had conducted 11 days of independent operations in a combat zone behind enemy lines, without orders, without support. How does a 4-man patrol survive for 11 days in a combat zone? The answer is training, discipline, and judgment. The 4 men would have moved only at night, when visibility was limited and when the PF LOAG fighters were less likely to be actively patrolling. They would have hidden during the day in positions that provided concealment and defensive capability. They would have moved along routes that they had memorized from maps and from their knowledge of the terrain. They would have maintained radio contact intermittently with the British command structure, transmitting brief reports on what they were observing and receiving instructions on where to move. They would have rationed their water carefully, knowing that dehydration in the mountains could kill as effectively as enemy fire. They would have avoided populated areas where the PF LOAG had presence. They would have moved toward areas where they knew the Sultan's forces were consolidated or where they expected to find advancing Dhofar Brigade elements. They would have been constantly alert to the possibility of encountering an enemy patrol. They would have been prepared to engage if encounter occurred, knowing that they were capable fighters with good weapons and good training, and they would have understood, in a way that civilians never can understand, that staying alive in these circumstances is about understanding the enemy's patterns, predicting the enemy's movements, and positioning yourself where the enemy is not. 4 trained SAS soldiers in the mountains of Oman, with radio communication and with the knowledge that British forces were operating in the region, would have had a good probability of survival. They would have not been comfortable. They would not have had sufficient water or sufficient food. But they would have had the training and the judgment that made survival possible. And they survived. 11 days in the mountains of Oman, operating without orders, without support, without an extraction plan that was still valid. What does 11 days mean in the context of a military campaign that would last for 4 more years? In one sense, it was a small moment in a much larger story. The Dhofar War would continue. The PF LOAG would eventually be defeated. The Sultan would consolidate his position. British involvement would gradually wind down. In another sense, those 11 days were crucial. They demonstrated that the BATT framework could accommodate independent operations. They demonstrated that SAS soldiers could operate without orders when the situation demanded it. They demonstrated that the deniability structure was flexible enough to absorb even fairly significant deviations from the approved mission profile. And they demonstrated, most importantly, that the SAS understood something about how the government worked, how the process of deniability worked, and how to leverage that understanding to accomplish missions that served national interests, even if they were not formally authorized. The 4 men who conducted those 11 days of operations understood that their mission had changed. They understood that they were no longer advisors. They understood that they were combat operators. They understood that the orders that had authorized them to be in Oman in an advisory capacity had been superseded by circumstances, and they acted accordingly. They continued the operation, they gathered intelligence, they survived, and they exfiltrated intact, and the government would never officially acknowledge that they had done so. The after-action report on those 11 days would have been a remarkable document if it had ever been written in its full and unclassified form. It would have detailed a 4-man patrol operating independently for 11 days in a combat zone with minimal resources. It would have documented the tactical decisions that had been made at every stage. It would have detailed the enemy contacts that had occurred, the intelligence that had been gathered, the actions that had been taken to survive and to complete the mission. It would have constituted a case study in how small teams could operate with minimal support in denied areas, how they could sustain themselves, how they could continue to function as a fighting force despite being isolated and abandoned by the official command structure. But that report was never written in any unclassified form, or if it was written, it was written in such heavily classified form that it would never appear in any official history of the Oman campaign. The official history, such as it exists in declassified form, concentrates on the larger operations, on the battles, on the overall strategic situation. The role of the BATT teams, and particularly the role of this specific 4-man patrol, was minimized, obscured, and eventually essentially forgotten outside the regiment itself. The reason was uncomplicated, even though it was never stated openly. Acknowledgement of those 11 days would have forced the British government to take a public position on what had been happening in Oman, and the public position would have had to be that the British government had been lying about what the SAS was doing there. The government had said consistently, had said in Parliament in response to questions, had said in diplomatic forums, that the SAS was not conducting combat operations in Oman. The SAS was present as trainers and advisors, but the SAS was conducting combat operations. The British government knew the SAS was conducting combat operations. Every person in the chain who had oversight of the operation knew what was happening, but the lie had to be maintained. Because if the lie was exposed, then all the other questions would be asked. Why hadn't Parliament been informed? What legal authority did the government have? What was the strategic objective? What were the rules of engagement? Were there other BATT teams conducting combat operations? How many? For how long? The questions would spiral, and therefore, anything that would make the lie untenable had to be buried or hidden or classified so thoroughly that no one would ever be able to prove that it had happened. The 4 men of that BAT team knew what they'd done. They had been there. They had made the decisions. They had survived the experience. The regiment knew what they'd done. The officers above them knew what they'd done. Some members of the political hierarchy in London knew what they'd done. But officially, in the public record, in the parliamentary record, in the diplomatic record, it had never happened. It would never officially happen. The deniability was maintained because the alternative, admitting the truth about British military operations in Oman, was politically impossible. And so the operation disappeared into a kind of institutional limbo, real to everyone who had been there, real to the regiment, real to the government officers who had chosen to allow it to happen by not explicitly forbidding it, but not real to anyone outside, not real in Parliament, not real in the public record, not real in any official sense. That remains the case today. The 4 men who conducted those 11 days of independent operations are known to the regiment. Their operation is remembered, but it will never be officially acknowledged. The deniability has held for more than 50 years, and it will probably hold forever. The 4 men who conducted those 11 days of operations possessed a combination of skills that allowed them to survive and to accomplish their mission. They were trained in navigation, in map reading, in terrain association, in silent movement. They were trained to move through populated areas without being detected. They were trained to survive on minimal rations and minimal water. They were trained to engage in firefights with superior forces and to suppress that fire long enough to escape contact. They were trained to understand the local terrain and to use that understanding to position themselves in ways that minimized their profile and maximized their ability to observe. They were trained to understand the enemy's patterns of movement and to avoid those patterns. They were trained to maintain their weapons, to treat injuries, to continue operating under stress and fatigue and fear. All of these skills combined with the specific knowledge that the patrol had developed over months in Oman, knowledge of the mountains, knowledge of where the PF Loag operated, the knowledge of where the Sultan's forces were consolidated, made it possible for them to survive. They were not superhuman. They were simply well-trained soldiers operating in an environment where they had developed expertise. But that expertise made the difference between success and failure, between survival and death. The sergeant who commanded the patrol was someone who had made a decision on his own authority, without waiting for orders, without checking with higher command. That decision had been to transform the mission from one of defense to one of survival and evasion. That decision had been exactly correct. The sergeant understood the situation. The sergeant understood that staying in place meant death or capture. The sergeant understood that moving meant a chance of survival. The sergeant made the decision that any competent military commander would have made in those circumstances. But the decision was not authorized. It was not approved. It was made because the sergeant understood that authorization and approval were not going to be forthcoming and that waiting for them would be fatal. What is remarkable about the deniability framework in Oman is how durable it has proven to be. Decades have passed. The Cold War has ended. The Dhofar War was won. The Sultan's government is still in power. The PF Loag is no longer a threat. The geopolitical situation that made the deniability necessary has changed fundamentally, and yet the deniability still holds. No government official has ever officially acknowledged that the 4-man BTT team conducted independent combat operations on June 18, 1972. And no government document has ever officially confirmed that the team conducted 11 days of independent operations without orders or formal support. The structure of deniability that was built more than 50 years ago has proven more resilient than almost anyone would have predicted. It has survived changes in government. It has survived changes in the political situation. It has survived the passage of time. It has survived the declassification of many other secret operations. And it endures still. The reason it endures is that everyone involved has had a stake in maintaining it. The government has had a stake in maintaining it because admitting the truth would have forced confrontations with Parliament that would have been politically damaging. The SAS has had a stake in maintaining it because the existence of the BTT framework as a deniability mechanism has allowed the regiment to conduct operations that would otherwise have been impossible. And the 4 men themselves have had a stake in maintaining it because the deniability allowed them to conduct operations that served national interests, and to do so without becoming casualties of a political argument about whether those operations should have been conducted. The deniability framework is not just a clever solution to a political problem. It is a protection mechanism that allows necessary operations to be conducted in ways that are politically tolerable. And as long as it remains useful for conducting necessary operations, it will continue to endure. The 4 men who conducted those 11 days are now old men or are deceased. But their operation remains classified, and it will probably remain classified forever, because that is how deniability works. You don't acknowledge it, you don't explain it, you maintain the fiction, and you move on. The 4 SAS men who survived those 11 days in the mountains of Oman never became public figures. Their names were not released. Their operation was never officially acknowledged. Their survival was not celebrated in any official capacity. They returned to their duties. They continued to conduct operations in Oman. They eventually rotated out of the theater and returned to the United Kingdom. Some would go on to other operations. Some would eventually leave the military. But the significance of what they had done, the demonstration that SAS soldiers could operate without orders, without support, without formal authorization, and could continue to accomplish military objectives in a manner that served national interests. That significance would echo through the history of British special operations for decades to come. The 11 days they spent in the mountains of Oman became part of regimental legend. It became part of how the SAS understood itself, part of how the regiment understood the relationship between the military and the government, part of how the regiment understood its role in national security. The four men had done something that was not supposed to be possible. They had done it successfully. They had survived. And the government had chosen not to acknowledge what they had done. That became the model. That became the understanding. The SAS would do what was necessary. The government would provide deniability, and everyone involved would understand the rules of the game. The decision to allow the four SAS men to continue operating without orders, without formal support, without an extraction plan, was not made explicitly. It was made by silence. It was made by the absence of orders to cease. It was made by the continued provision of minimal support, radio contact, the knowledge that British forces were in the region, the understanding that if the operation could be brought to a close, extraction would be provided. The British government, at some level, understood what was happening. Senior officers understood what was happening. The chain of command understood what was happening. And they chose to allow it to happen. They chose to maintain the fiction that the BATT team was still conducting an advisory mission. They chose not to formally authorize combat operations. They chose to create a space where the SAS could do what needed to be done, with the understanding that if anyone ever asked, the government could claim that it had not been aware of what was happening, or that the operations had exceeded their mandate, or that the BATT team had acted on its own initiative without authorization. That deniability was valuable. It allowed operations to be conducted. It protected the government politically. It protected the SAS politically. It was a mutual agreement to maintain a fiction that allowed necessary operations to be conducted. Operation Jaguar, the assault on the Jebel that had been launched in October 1971, months before the four-man BATT team's crisis in the Jebel Akhdar, was in many ways the foundation that made the deniability framework possible. Operation Jaguar was the assault on the main PF-LOAG stronghold on the Jebel. It involved Omani forces, British advisors, RAF helicopter support, and careful coordination of multiple elements to achieve a surprise assault on PF-LOAG positions. Operation Jaguar was, as military operations go, successful. It achieved its objectives. It inflicted significant casualties on the PF-LOAG. It broke the momentum of the insurgency. But Operation Jaguar also required that the British government acknowledge, at least minimally, that the SAS was involved. The RAF personnel involved in the operation saw British soldiers on the ground. Omani soldiers worked alongside British soldiers. The physical presence of British military personnel became impossible to deny. But the solution was elegant. The British government did not deny it. What the government did was place it in a framework, the BAT framework, that made it officially acceptable. BAT teams were not combat units. BAT teams were advisors. If BAT teams participated in operations, they were participating in an advisory capacity, not as combat troops. This framework held. It held through Operation Jaguar. It held for the broader campaign in Oman. And it held for the four-man patrol that should have been evacuated on June 18, 1972, but that instead stayed on the ground and continued to operate. The maintenance of this fiction required that the patrol never officially exist as a combat element. They were always BAT advisors, even when they were conducting independent direct action operations. They were always in an advisory capacity, even when they were the only armed force in their area and they were making unilateral tactical decisions.